want Republicans dead.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hey folks, it's Rick, and welcome back to the Enemies List. Our guest today is a fascinating thinker. It's Ian Bremmer. Ian is the president and founder of the Eurasia Group. He's a political scientist. He's a writer. He's a speaker. And he's one of the people I've really been excited to talk to because he is one of the bigger thinkers about the world that's coming towards us on the international front. He's one of the people that has deeply considered the shape of not only the world as it is right now, but the world we're about to enter into, whether we want to or not. And so, Ian, I wanted to start out, you've written and talked an awful lot about, the shifting multipolar world that we live in. As a young Cold War guy, I was there for the wall to come down, and that was what I worked in that space back in that day. And there was that presumption of the end of history and that presumption that, democratic free market capitalism was going to be the only flavor in the world and that America would be the dominant long-term superpower. And it just hasn't quite worked out that way. Talk to us a little bit about where you see the world at this moment, both in the traditional great power realignments and also what you've talked about and written about in the recent times about how this technical and tech world superpower is emerging inside of what is through the traditional political multipolar space.
Well, first, Rick, pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.
And I saw that you had my buddy Fareed on
I did
the other day, and we've known each other for 30 years. I adore him. I'm sure it was a great conversation. But we overlap a lot, but we also have some different perspectives. So, first, why is it that 30 years after the wall came down, a lot of our presumptions seem to be wrong? Geopolitically, there are three big reasons. One is that when the Soviet Union collapsed, NATO expanded, the European Union expanded, but Russia was not integrated into Western institutions, not at all. And you can blame them, you can blame us, you can say it's both. But the point is that today, Russia is a rogue state that wants the collapse of the West. They want chaos in the international order, and their closest allies are other rogue states, Iran, North Korea. That is a really big problem, right? So that's reason number one. They're angry, they're in decline, and they blame us. Second reason is that China has been brought into the global marketplace, helped drive globalization. They got a lot richer. They're the second largest economy in the world. Many people believe they will become number one within a decade. Whether or not you believe that, the fact is they're far more powerful than they were when the wall came down. But they did not become more democratic. They did not reform their political system and even their economic system, which they had been reforming at the time that the wall came down. They have now started to reconsolidate under the state. Privately owned national champions, state-owned enterprises controlled by the Communist Party. So that's the second big reason. And the third big reason is that while those first two things were happening outside the West and not in alignment with what we wanted, what we hoped, what the end of history might be, inside the West, people were getting angry at their political leaders. Inside the West, you had a lot of people that were saying my institutions are no longer legitimate, particularly true in our own United States. Now, there are lots of reasons for those things happening, but the one thing that was really not anticipated back when the wall came down, developments in technology largely helped democracies. We were talking about the communications revolution. It was just the beginning of, people getting their internet accounts. In fact, 89, I wasn't quite there yet, but I was going to be in another year or two. And this is what led to the Arab Spring. This is what led to the colored revolutions in the former Soviet Union. People with access to information, with greater transparency, and the kleptocracy, the corruption, the repression that their governments deployed against them, wanting to unshackle themselves from those governments. This technology supported open, liberal, and I use that term in the classical sense, not in the left-right sense, democracies undermine authoritarian regimes. In the last 10 years, we have shifted from a communications revolution, bottom up, to a surveillance revolution, a data revolution, top down, which has empowered authoritarian regimes that know how to use technology and which have undermined civil societies. And so I would say that, the best way I can answer your question is those three geopolitical trends, which are bad, underpinned by this massive technological change that has actually given authoritarian regimes a much greater capacity to become more stable, more effective, and deploy more power.
Yeah, I think that presumption that greater market forces and widespread information technology would inevitably cause the diminishment of authoritarianism. I think we in the arcs of technological improvements of surveillance, and maybe authoritarianism declined a little bit, but they didn't cross at the right point on those two separate arcs, because the increasing amount of look, I can tell you, I know a former National Security Agency person who's perfectly legally working for an Emirati government right now, implementing something that they could never have done in the U.S. in terms of surveillance and control of their population.
Sure.
And the money
an
is
ally of the United States.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
The money is terrific. The software and hardware systems are horrific. And yet that's a world that it feels like we're more detached from American values that we once proclaimed, because we're empowering that. The technology doesn't come from authoritarian countries are not great at producing the kind of bleeding edge tech that we do. And I'm sort of fascinated. They're good at deploying it. They're not as great at building it out.
I don't know.
China maybe, but
yeah. I think that there's an open question here,
okay.
right? Which is that when I look at AI,
mm-hmm.
And I look at large language models, frontier models, I see American corporations as dominating the world.
Sure.
When I see the most advanced transition of carbon energy to post-carbon energy, nuclear, wind, solar, electric vehicles, batteries, the Chinese are world class. They didn't steal that from anyone else. They're actually doing it themselves. So I'm only saying that as Americans who, my entire childhood to adult life, was born of the presumption that the Americans dominate good technology. And I don't think we should sit on those presumptions in today's more multipolar environment.
Right. So the idea that there's an emergent technology-driven superpower out there that is beyond the national interests of even their host countries. Mm-hmm. And again, this is a longer conversation than we have time for, but the idea that we've got these emergent large language models that will, at some point in the indefinite but not in infinite future, transition to AGI and things like that. There are a lot of American companies right now that I know American political leadership. I don't think anyone's ready for that transition. And the things that led a lot of people to discontent in our culture during globalization, I think will be dwarfed by the emergence of much broader technological developments that are going to blow a giant hole in the middle and upper middle class of the country. Where do you see that affecting how the U.S. and how the world looks? Because I think a lot of Western democracies are in for a big shock that many, many people in their population are about to be made redundant because of AI and technological advancements.
A lot of ways to answer that question. Clearly, when we look at the deployment of social media, which is a tiny fraction of the power and disruption of what we're going to see with AI in the next several years, there was a complete absence of regulation.
Right.
That undermined American civil society. It caused an awful lot of damage and disinformation. And it's not because the companies want to destroy democracy. That just happens to be an indirect negative externality of their business model that they will not take responsibility for. They're capitalists when it comes to profit, and they're socialists when it comes to risk. Right? Yeah, absolutely. So I first of all, Rick, I accept your concern that what is coming down the pike in short order is going to dwarf the other challenges that are on our plate. And when you talk about AGI, artificial general intelligence, which is not about sentient computing, but it's about the capabilities of these virtual beings to basically deploy human level intelligence or greater, and really it's greater, in every field. And if you, as of right now, as of a week ago, that's the last time I looked at this, by the way, if you were to survey, crowdsource the top experts, thousands of top experts on AI around the world, their assumption is that AGI comes around 2032. In other words, this is not the far off future. This is something that we're going to be dealing with like now. And yeah, I would say that it's not that I'm so worried about the middle class per se, at least not in the United States, because if the American companies are dominating this, and if they're driving incredible amounts of profitability, and that leads to increasingly asymmetrical power of the United States in this space, then the ability of the US to tax and the ability of the US to redistribute, those will be policy decisions. And those policy decisions may well be made too late, and they may well be made in a captive way to the corporations, in which case the people can revolt against that. They can vote against that. So you've got an opportunity to fix this, right? But when I think about the impact it's going to have on society, so not about the middle class, but people, because I don't think that we're creating new humans, but I do think that artificial intelligence, as it gets closer to AGI and as it trains on our individual data on our smartphones, we are creating virtual beings that can make us more like computers, because we will enjoy engaging with them. They will be infinitely patient. They will laugh at all of our jokes. They will understand how to mirror us. They will understand how to convince us, to compel us, to sell to us, to capture our attention. And unless we have very strong regulatory controls on where those AIs are deployed and where they are not, and we have a government that is not inclined to over-regulate on these new technologies, then I worry that we're no longer going to be training young kids through networks of their peers and through the public school system and through their parents, but instead we're going to train them algorithmically on the basis of business models that treat these people as agglomerations of data to be profited from. And that is the opposite of the creation of a civil society. So that is a much greater concern of mine than what happens to the middle class in the United States. Because
that's really interesting.
The middle class we can do something about. This one, I think we're not on a path to.
I mean, when we look at the influence that social platforms have had, even in their current iteration, which is not as juiced by the AI AGI moment, they're stone knives and bearskins era right now. I mean, we see that Facebook fundamentally reshaped sort of the baby boomer Gen X generation politically in the last decade. We're watching TikTok right now reshape the political values and sort of mental landscapes of young voters, young Americans under the age of 25, under the age of 30, perhaps.
Absolutely.
Is any government that isn't an authoritarian government ready to sufficiently regulate or manage those platforms anywhere in the world in a way that protects the rights of their citizens and the interest of their countries. I don't feel like the U.S. has that ability, and I wonder if anyone does.
Well, I mean, it's not that the Americans don't have that ability. It's that, we've made choices that put us at a disadvantage in making those sorts of policies. So I was just with I'm going to drop a name here. My friend, the Norwegian Prime Minister, Jens Støre, and his government has just put rules in place that if you are in public school, which is all the schools in Norway, you don't have smartphones in those schools.
God bless him.
God bless him. Authoritarian Norway, right? And I got to tell you, Rick, I mean, I don't see parents in uproar. I don't see students in uproar in Norway. So that's a start. I think that the Europeans across the board who are much more inclined to regulate at the expense of their economic growth, at the expense of attracting investment, at the expense of attracting entrepreneurs. So there are real negatives there, but they are much more interested in ensuring that they have a social contract that works for their families, that works for their elderly, that works for their young people. And that's meant an EU AI Act that is much more concerned about how your data is used, for example. And I think that most countries in Europe, as a consequence, will be much more willing and capable of significantly restricting what some of these AI models can do and how they can be deployed at a significant cost to the technology companies that want access to the European market, the world's largest common market. It is still true that the technology is moving much faster than the governments. It is still true that the companies have a much better understanding of what these models can and can't do than the government. So they are still at a significant disadvantage, even the EU, in getting this right. But there are all sorts of countries out there that have a better shot of this kind of regulation to protect society than the Americans do.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me because as somebody who has dealt with persuasion and advertising and communications my whole career, I am in awe of the ability of these platforms to change behavior and to change attitudes. And, I think we see a lot of that happening with younger voters right now who, let's be perfectly honest, a year ago could not have found Gaza on a map. And yet now it has become driven in large measure by TikTok and social media platforms, sort of the cause celeb of a young generation right now.
Well, come on. Now, first of all, all right. In a recent survey, in terms of what issues are most important to youngest Americans, it was 13% said Middle East.
Yeah.
So this is a very small number of people who happen to be very useful to political entrepreneurs on the far left and the far right that want to make hay out of that. Like, I just gave the graduation speech at Columbia Steepa on Monday, and I went there. I talked directly about Israel and Gaza, and I called out the hostages, not just the Palestinians. Not one person turned their back. Not one person left the room. And I got to tell you, in Colombia, I mean, you would have thought that was impossible if you watch the news because everybody there supports Hamas, right? Almost no one there supports Hamas. That's insanity.
That's heartening. I watched your address. Your folks had sent it over, and I think that's incredibly heartening. That you challenged them a little bit and just said, "Look, the world out there is going to be something very different than what you think it is right now."
Yeah.
But I'm always curious. Like I said, the persuasive power of these platforms, the attention focusing ability of them. I worry once that's driven by even better AI tools, how much that's going to affect the future of American democracy and the future of look, I come out of that internationalist wing of the Republican Party from the old days. I'm 60 years old, so you sort of, I worked for George Herbert Walker Bush, not, and that idea that we had an American role to play in an international order. I wonder if we're going to be able to sustain that as the world changes so radically, and as this sort of new axis while I don't think that Putin's going to win China over as a full partner in whatever this vision he has is, because they're too tied to us. I wonder
the Chinese. I agree with that, Rick. I agree with that. And the Chinese need stability, and they can't afford to alienate all the Europeans and all the Asian allies of the U.S. So I agree. They're oriented, they're ideologically oriented to support Russia, but only so far. I agree completely.
I guess I'm looking for, where do you see the future of traditional liberal Western democracy in this altered multipolar world where China, India, have a vastly expanded role to play in the world economy? Russia has a role as a chaos agent to play in the world economy. Yep. And this sort of technocracy that's developing out there takes its place in the world economic and power ecosystem. Where do you see the future of the traditional idea that America could promote a value set that was about individual liberty and freedom and Western capitalism and free markets?
It's more constrained, and it requires more allies. And it also requires more allies, not just among governments, but also in a more multi-stakeholder approach, corporations, NGOs, multilateral institutions, you name it. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you're the United States and you want to lead a policy in response to the Russians invading Ukraine, it's much more effective if you have NATO as a whole on board. Right. And the Europeans are indeed spending more than the Americans are in response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Americans are doing more militarily, the Europeans are doing more economically, and that makes it more likely it will continue under either Biden or Trump. But if the Americans were going it alone, it would be much harder. And by the way, one of the big problems Biden has in the Middle East is that he's not going it with the Gulf states and Egypt and Jordan and the Europeans. He's going it alone. And he's gotten himself in incredible trouble as a consequence of that. This will be harder for Trump than Biden because Trump is not an isolationist, but he is more of a unilateralist. And so, his belief is, well, American power will force these countries to do what we want, which is true near term in a transactional way. You're much bigger than Mexico. You say you're going to hit them hard if they don't clamp down on the border. Trump's approach will be more effective in getting the Mexicans to clamp down on the border. But longer term, and Trump doesn't care about longer term. Most American politicians don't. But Americans, as people do, longer term, if you give up on multilateral institutions, shared values, and coalition building, America will have a harder and harder time getting the world to nudge in the direction that is aligned with our interests. And that I think is the great danger, the grave danger, with the fact that so many Americans believe that their own political leaders and institutions are no longer legitimate. They don't know what America stands for from a values perspective. They certainly don't agree intrinsically that America should promote democracy around the world, that America should promote market access and free trade, or that America should promote being a global policeman individually or collectively. And those are precisely the values, however imperfectly, however hypocritically, that the historic presidents of the United States, leaders of the United States during globalization were really on top of.
Yeah, I think there was a consensus view inside both parties that did have a sort of definitional character to American interaction with the world from, let's say from Truman onward, from Truman to Trump, essentially. And institutionally, even under Trump, there was a lot of a carry through of that sort of, at the Defense Department level, State Department level, et cetera. So Ian, we're coming up on time here. I wanted to ask you one last question. What is the one piece of advice? And I say this because I watched your Columbia CIFA commencement address. What's the one piece of advice you would give somebody who is coming up right now, out of college, ready to enter into this new world of ours, who wants to make a difference in terms of sustaining and perpetuating the kind of American values and the kind of peace and democracy and economic prosperity that Americans they want underneath it all. What would your counsel to someone coming up be?
I think the thing that's hardest to do and is the most valuable to do, because so few people are willing to actually live it, is to engage with, read, follow people that you intellectually respect but don't agree with.
Mm-hmm.
I do it all the time.
Same.
But it is advice that, especially if you are algorithmically trained, is very, very hard to do. It is so much more comfortable to just hang out with people that are blowing smoke up your ass. And that's true for really powerful Americans with a lot of money, and you and I know who they are. But it's also really true for young people that are in, sort of elite institutions, and they've just been educated with a whole bunch of people that are like-minded, and now they come out and they think that everyone's going to be like that. That really constrains you, because the world, it's not just that the United States has different flavors of folks. It's that also the United States, in an increasingly multipolar world, the United States doesn't reflect the opinions of the rest of the world. You talked about TikTok before. Well, of course, the main reason why TikTok has been such a hotbed of pro-Palestinian sentiment is because TikTok is a global app, not in China, but the rest of the world. There's just a lot more Muslims than Jews. And, it is really important for the average person in the United States to engage and understand what those different perspectives are. The United States worldview is increasingly a minority worldview. And you may think that the difference between the far left and the far right in the United States is really great, but in reality, it's still pretty narrow compared to the worldview of the average person from the Middle East or India or China or anywhere else. And the more that young people are capable of understanding those legitimate differences that come just by virtue of where you were accidentally born, right? The more effective you will be. In trying, because what civic institutions are all about, not so much about celebrating diversity, but taking that diversity and harmonizing it, taking that diversity and finding threads of common humanity. And you can't do that if you don't understand where these people come from. You can't connect with them. Celebrating diversity is the start. It's not the end. Right? Okay, we're all different people. But if you don't take those different people and find ways that you can have a conversation with them, connect with them, feel them as common human beings, you failed in creating civil society. United States is not about diversity. United States is about harmony. And our young people do not yet get that.
I think that's a terrific observation. And I think that the minute you're out of the bubble and into the world, things start changing as the eyes of a student and the eyes of somebody who suddenly gets out in the world are much different. I remember when I got to the Pentagon, all my theoretical academic knowledge about the Soviet Union went straight out the window.
Straight out the window.
It was all of a sudden it was much more about the internal corruptions of it than any ideological or wiring diagram you'd read about. And I think what your point there about perspectives beyond the things that you come up comfortable, feeling comfortable reading and thinking about, it's really vital. Well, Ian Bremmer, I want to thank you so very much for coming on the show today. I am
a real pleasure,
I'm deeply
Rick,
grateful.
Honestly, you're a good guy, and I was looking forward to it.
Thank you. Well, let's stay in touch and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Sounds good.
Thanks.
Hey, look, I get it. There is this natural instinct when Trump does a rally or an event to show the close-up shot of Trump and take their word for it. But let's be real here for a second. All the media that took the hook on this Bronx rally, he's going to attract African-American and Hispanic voters in the Bronx by huge numbers, and New York is on the... Get your heads out of your collective asses. The rally had a few hundred people. It was not thousands or tens of thousands or millions or whatever alternative fact number was pulled out of the ass of whatever Trumpian weirdo was pitching the story to the press. Okay? None of this is real. And all these Trump rallies that they claim 10,000, 50,000, 100,000 people, most of them have about 100, 200 people. The vast majority of them are a couple hundred people. He plays you over and over again. For the love of God, media, show the wide shot, or else you're going to be on the enemies list.